The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Oh,
We hear you, Gwen.
okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gwen, and we will be starting in just about 5 minutes our webinar on vulnerable and underserved victim advocacy for incarcerated survivors with mental illness. We hope that you are here today to join us for that webinar. If you aren't, we hope you'll stay anyway because it's going to be a terrific conversation this afternoon. Like I said, we'll start just at about, well, 4 minutes now. Thank you for being with us. I'm trying to...
I see your screen, Gwen.
Yeah, but every time, well, I'm sorry.
Just click on the lower right-hand corner. There you go.
Yeah, but when I do that, then my PowerPoint disappears on me.
Click on the PowerPoint. Sorry,
Okay,
guys.
there we go. Yeah, I'm sorry. Technical difficulties on here.
Now try to
Great.
forward again, just to make sure.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Oh, look, there we are. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Gwen, should we wait a couple minutes to let other people come on?
Well, I think we probably can go ahead and start just the intro, and then anyone that joins us, you know, if they want to go back and watch the initial slides, can do so since we're recording the webinar.
Great.
I know that people's time is really valuable, so I'd like to just go ahead and get started. Thank you for asking, Edward.
Yep. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome you to this 90-minute webinar. It's the third in a series JDI is doing looking at vulnerable and underserved populations. The focus of today's webinar is incarcerated survivors with mental illness. The goal is to increase victim advocates' knowledge, skills, and abilities to serve these survivors who reside in detention settings. My name is Edward Cervantes, and I'm a program officer in JDI's LA office. In that role, I provide research and administrative assistance to JDI's training and technical assistance programs for corrections agencies and victim advocacy programs nationwide. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We'll have time at the end to answer questions, but please feel free to enter them at any time in the little comments box on the right-hand side. The webinar will be recorded. A recording will be posted on the JDI website in the coming weeks, along with a discussion guide with resources. Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI fulfills its mission by 1. Working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, by promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and by supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The core principle underlying all of JDI's work is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. JDI appreciates the support of the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice for its grant funding that enabled today's webinar. And today's training will include stories about sexual violence, including directly from survivors. Please practice self-care during this presentation. And now I will turn things over to my colleague, Gwen Smith-Downs.
Edward, thank you. I really appreciate the introduction, and we welcome everyone this afternoon, or let's see, depending what time zone you're in, it may be morning there. Thank you for choosing to join us today. I am Gwen Smith-Downs, as Edward said, and I'm a Senior Program Director in our Washington, D.C. office here with Just Detention International. A major focus of my work is providing technical assistance to victim advocates and corrections agencies in their efforts to implement effective victim services programs for incarcerated survivors. And for today's webinar objectives, as Edward mentioned, we will be focusing on incarcerated survivors with mental illness. These are people who have been sexually abused while living in detention settings. For the purpose of today's webinar, we'll refer to detention as any form of confinement operated by any jurisdiction in the United States. It could be a local jail, a police lockup, a state or federal prison, immigration facility, a juvenile justice facility, or perhaps a community corrections facility. This is the third webinar in the 6-part series, of course, for advocates who are working with the most vulnerable and underserved incarcerated survivors. If you've missed one or more of the preceding webinars or what is to follow, we do have good news. As Edward said, we are recording these and they will be archived on JDI's website. We will tell you more about how to access those at the end of the webinar. Many of you who are tuning in to today's webinar are already familiar with the failed policies in this country in the 1960s and 70s. This was known as the deinstitutionalization movement. Some believe that this was actually precipitated by policies as early as the 1950s. It had good intentions, and its goal was to discharge thousands of patients with mental illness from state mental hospitals to psychiatric facilities, and psychiatric facilities. They were to receive services from community mental health centers instead. Well, however, there weren't adequate services to support them in the communities, and as a result, this has been referred to as the trans-institutionalization. Thousands of people with mental illness ended up in homeless shelters, on the street, or, as we have become all too familiar, involved with the criminal justice system and in jails and prisons. Let's take a look at what we want to cover with you today on our agenda. We will be framing the issue for you, talking through incarcerated survivor issues from the data perspective, looking at some of the dynamics in a day in the life of an incarcerated survivor with mental illness. There are a few protections under PREA specifically in the standards that we will point out. And we do have a practitioner who is joining us today. We're excited to have with us someone who we will introduce at a later point to give us some advice and guidance. As always with our webinars, we offer the opportunity for an interaction on a question and answer where you'll have a chance to ask your own questions. So be thinking of those throughout, and Edward will guide us through that process as we get closer to the last 20 minutes or so of our time together today. Just a quick reminder about language. You might hear us use the term inmate, prisoner, or even offender. We're going to use those interchangeably to refer to people in custody. In a juvenile setting, you might hear people use the term youth, resident, or ward. We will also use the term incarcerated survivor. This is how we refer to someone who's in detention setting who's been sexually victimized. The victimization may have been at any point in their life. It doesn't necessarily have to have happened while the person was incarcerated. But if it happened while incarcerated, it doesn't have to have happened while they were living in their current facility. The PREA standards refer to survivors as victims, and the standards also call the incarcerated people who are survivors of sexual abuse, it calls for them to have access to services such as confidential communication with outside advocates in as confidential a manner as possible. Many of you listening today are already aware of this, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because we hope that you have been familiarized with that in previous training, and we do have webinars that are archived for you if you want to have more detailed information and training on that. There is no time limit on when or a specification as to where the abuse may have occurred, as I mentioned, in order for them to access victim services and support from advocates, however. So let's now move into talking about how we're going to frame the discussion today for our webinar. Before we do, I want to give you a little bit of information about, for those of you who've made today's webinar a priority in your schedule. We have a few questions that we're going to present to you in a poll that we would like you to participate in from your own computers. Our questions will provide you, provide us, and in turn you, because we will give you a little bit of feedback, some information on where you work and the kinds of services that are being provided to incarcerated survivors with mental illness. Edward's going to help us a little bit in the background with the technical aspects, so let's go with our first poll. Here it is. You can see it on the screen. Does your agency have a policy on providing services to clients with mental illness? So your options are yes, no, or you may be unsure. So we'll give you an opportunity here to answer that. Okay, looks like we're getting ready for the results of the poll.
Could you see the results, Gwen, or should
No,
I
cannot.
Okay.
So if you can go ahead and share those.
Sure. 54% said yes, 15% said no, that's 1-5, and 32% said unsure.
Okay, so it sounds like, I think that's terrific that we have more than half of us listening today or participating that do have a policy in place regarding services to clients with mental illness. 32% unsure, so that's probably something that we hope that you will take away from participating today, an opportunity to go back and check with your organization and see if you've got a policy in place. If you do, please take the opportunity to look into that policy and better understand. For the 15% that don't, if you want to reach out to us or reach out to sister organizations or the coalition in your state and see if you can get perhaps a sample copy of the policy. It might be something that you want to take a look at within your own organization to see whether or not it's something appropriate for you to work on putting together. So next, need to look at our second goal. Have you had training on providing services to clients with mental illness? This is the simple yes or no for the answer options here today. Have you had training on providing services to clients with mental illness? And the poll is now open for you to answer.
Okay. That was 55% yes and 45% no.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like there's an opportunity there for some perhaps cross collaboration and training support, with more than half of our participants having received the training and just under half not having had training in this area. Again, sister organizations might be able to work with one another in providing the training, and look to your coalition organization to also assist you with that, or contact Just Detention International, and we'll see what we can do about getting you connected. There's also a really valuable resource in most of the local communities around the country. If you have a chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, you can look at NAMI's NAMI.org at their national website, and you'll be able to look up a local organization based on your zip code and see if they've got a local chapter. They provide free training on better understanding persons with mental illness and how to support and work with people with mental illness. So it might be something you want to look into, providing a collaborative training with them and bringing them in to help support the needed resources and training you might have for your organization. The last poll we have for you right now is, have you provided victim services to incarcerated survivors with mental illness? Have you provided victim services to incarcerated survivors with mental illness? 3 options for answers: yes, no, or unsure. And of course, you know whether or not you might have provided services, or perhaps you're aware of whether your agency has provided services, but you might not always be aware whether the survivors that you provide those services to have a mental illness. So that might be why you would answer unsure here.
Okay. So we have 36% yes, 40% no, and 24% unsure.
Okay. All right. Well, we hope then that today's webinar is going to give you some helpful insight, regardless of whether you have had the opportunity to provide services or you're unsure whether the clients that you've worked with might have had mental illness. And for those 36% who have worked with incarcerated survivors with mental illness, we look forward to you also offering some of your insight, perhaps during the question and answer segment. If we have a question and you might have an answer to share, if you could just tap that into the chat box, we'd welcome your comments and guidance as well. So we're going to take a look at the data and see what it tells us about mental illness, incarceration, and sexual victimization in the United States. Of course, again, many of you who are with us have that experience working with survivors in mental illness. For most, this experience comes from working with clients in your community, and for quite a few of you, it might also include working with incarcerated survivors. We don't always know, like I said, whether someone has been a diagnosed mental illness. There are many challenges that you face as advocates who are looking to address these complex needs of all of the different survivors that you work with. Add that additional layer of being incarcerated and the challenges increase significantly. So we want to talk about some of that today and hopefully give you some information that'll be helpful. Many prisoners with mental illness are caught in this vicious cycle where their illness makes them more vulnerable to abuse, which in turn exacerbates their mental illness symptoms. Let's go through some of the data. We know that over 2.2 million adults, and that's about 60,000 youth as well, are incarcerated in our prisons and jails today and youth facilities around the country. Of that population, the over-incarceration of people with mental illness is really largely a result of that policy shift that I mentioned. Many of the old mental health facilities were overcrowded and had appalling conditions, and then with the emergence of the new medications and treatments for mental illness, policymakers considered it sensible to shut them down. I've talked to you about what those results were and what that meant for people who needed help, and how they've ended up in a different type of institutionalization, the de facto institutionalization and placement in our prisons and jails and juvenile facilities, community corrections. So this dramatic rise in incarceration rates in people with mental illness being placed in our facilities in the United States is exacerbated and making our country have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The number does not reflect over 5 million people that are on probation and parole, by the way. And it's important to note that because the PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act standards also apply to community confinement facilities that house many of those people on probation and parole, we want to remember to keep those additional numbers in mind. Most of the people who are incarcerated that are held, though, in state prisons, and the overwhelming majority of people who are in local jails have not been convicted of a crime. You might know this statistic, but just in case you don't, approximately 2/3 of the people on average around the country are pretrial status, not convicted of a crime at this point while they're in jail. Now, 2015, an article was published online. The data was compiled by SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the National Institute of Mental Health. It revealed that every year, about 18.2% of the total adult population in the United States suffers from some mental illness. Now, this generally is mental illnesses like depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. Even though mental illness is widely dispersed among the people in the United States, serious mental illness is primarily concentrated in a much smaller proportion, or about 6% of the people. This slide shows about 1 in every 17 people have a serious mental illness. The National Alliance on Mental Illness that I mentioned earlier, NAMI, says that half of all lifetime mental health conditions begin by age 14, and 75% begin by age 24. So think about what that means for our youth in our juvenile justice facilities. The SAMHSA data indicated also that approximately 4% of adult Americans experience serious mental illness. That is, their condition impedes their day-to-day activities such as going to work. And mental illness is also the leading cause of disability in the United States, that inability to get out and go to work. Many people suffer from more than one mental disorder at a given time, which you probably aren't surprised given the work that you've been doing. Nearly 45% of those with a mental illness also meet the criteria for having 2 or more disorders. In this country, mental disorders are diagnosed based on what we commonly refer to as the DSM-5. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Here's a quick statistic of a study in 2010 that found that people with serious mental health problems are over 3 times more likely to wind up in prison or jail than in a hospital. People with mental illness are drastically overrepresented among people who are behind bars, and many are locked up for minor offenses like theft, drug use, or disturbing the peace. As is often the case, the offense of a person who has a mental illness, especially those of the kind I just mentioned, is directly related to their illness. As a result, talked about it, we are the de facto psychiatric hospitals in our society, and we are not prepared to be so. Although inmate populations are demographically different from the U.S. population, general population, the differences in the prevalence of severe psychological distress remain significant when comparisons are made to demographic subgroups most commonly held in prisons and jails. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2013, and it's difficult to find more recent data, among males, 3% of the general U.S. population was identified with severe psychological distress, so 3% of the total U.S. population, compared to 14.7% of those living in prison and 26.3% of people housed in jails. So you can see incrementally the difference, those in the community to those living on the inside. Few corrections facilities have enough state-trained staff or resources to offer adequate mental health care within their facilities, and corrections mental health staff who work in the facilities describe having caseloads that include hundreds and hundreds of inmates often. As a result, as we might imagine, mental health staff often scramble to provide realistically just basic emergency services. They're kind of doing triage, and we will hear more about this today in our webinar when we talk with our practitioner, Dr. Diana Kucera, who is listening right now. Many inmates who desperately need more intensive help and who need therapy unfortunately go untreated. This chart from the Council of State Governments Justice Center shows the prevalence of mental health indicators among prisoners and jail inmates by type of indicator. This data is from 2011 to 2012. It remains fairly consistent. This is based on a history of mental health. You can see major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, and personality disorder. The most common mental health illnesses among those incarcerated. Another concern that's really escalated over the years is the number of youth, as we talked about and I referenced, with significant mental health needs involved in our juvenile justice system. And like adults, youth are often incarcerated for behaviors that stem from their mental illness. And for many youth in the juvenile system, their mental health needs are significantly complicated by the presence of a co-occurring drug or alcohol addiction. As we see here, 79% of these youth have symptoms of one or more mental health disorder, according to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Now let's move more directly into a slide you've probably seen before. If you've been doing work with PREA, this is something we show frequently, this slide. According to the estimate of Bureau of Justice Statistics, 200,000 people are sexually abused in these facilities, U.S. prisons and jails, each year. The figure represents the number of people, not incidents. Many of these 200,000 people are abused more than once. And let me just put this into perspective. This is approximately the population of Salt Lake City, Utah, 200,000 people, or Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that's every year. Over 200,000 people sexually abused in detention every year. Many of them are members of these groups, like those people with mental illness we talked about, who are subject to oppression and systemic marginalization in broader society. Prisoners with mental illness are at a much greater risk for victimization. In other words, once they've been abused, they are more likely to be abused more than one time. And look at this statistic. In fact, 80% of prisoners with a severe mental illness who were abused by another inmate were assaulted more than once. In detention, just like in communities, there are certain groups who are more vulnerable to sexual abuse. That same 2013 study cited is showing you on this slide that in adult facilities, we found that prisoners showed symptoms of severe psychological distress, were 9 times more likely than those with no such symptoms to be sexually abused by another inmate. That's an astonishing statistic. I'd like to illustrate for you now the difficulties of a survivor with mental illness by sharing with you the experience of a survivor who has written JDI several times. In her letters, she has detailed her concerns about her safety. For purposes of sharing her experiences, I'll refer to her as Kelly. Kelly has filed numerous PREA reports from the different prisons she's lived in, stating that correctional officers and inmates would come into her cell at night and spray something in her nose when she was asleep to incapacitate her so inmates could sexually assault her. She believes this because of the way she feels when she wakes up in the morning. She has also written that the prison is trying to kill her through the food and water that she thinks will give her a heart attack. Kelly said she'd lost a lot of weight because she does not trust the food. She washes and then microwaves anything before eating it and boils her water. She suspects her sister who raised her is in on it and in on a scheme with the warden, and that her sister bought a life insurance policy on her so that once the facility has killed her, her sister and the warden will cash in on the policy. Kelly was placed in a housing unit with a program that she said is for inmates with mental illnesses. She thinks the prison did this to buy time to kill her. Kelly wrote that she was very concerned because her psychologist had told her they were recommending antidepressants for her. A 3-person mental health panel reviewed the recommendation. She thinks it's an attempt to poison her or discredit her sexual abuse allegations. She won't cooperate with the psychiatrist and counselor in her facility because she doesn't trust them. Then Kelly's letter arrived at JDI, in which she shared the news that had devastated her. A psych evaluation had been concluded, and Kelly was diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder and delusional disorder. Her psychiatrist prescribed medications for her accordingly. She's refusing to take the medications because she believes that they are another attempt by the prison to try to induce her to have a heart attack, and that they will make her drowsy and more vulnerable to potential sexual assault. She wrote of being frustrated that the mental illness diagnosis is in retaliation for PREA reports that she's filed. PREA investigations have been completed on the reports that Kelly has filed. Every one of those PREA reports has been determined to be unsubstantiated. Where there's insufficient evidence to conclude one way or another, Kelly's experiences as a survivor with diagnosed mental illnesses now, none of those PREA reports can be determined one way or another, whether they are unfounded or substantiated. She's likely to have internalized depression for not being believed, and her ability to clearly communicate with her thoughts is difficult for her. This can make it less likely that she will come forward to report when sexually abused. As advocates, we meet Kelly where she is in her trauma and start from a place of believing. While the details she's written about and her diagnosis may seem consistent, our role is to provide her with emotional support, answer her questions related to her rights under PREA, and send her information and resources, with her permission, that can assist her in her healing and understanding of PREA. This is a photo of group therapy cages for inmates at Mule Creek State Prison in California. It may be somewhat shocking to see if you're unfamiliar with working in a high security detention or corrections unit. JDI also hears from survivors that the medical and mental health care they receive after being sexually abused can be inadequate or non-existent, and that medical and mental health providers have lacked the specialized training or experience to work with them as survivors of sexual abuse. This has been supported by comments and letters to JDI where survivors describe being treated in ways that can be defined as victim blaming, dismissive of common survivor concerns, or inappropriate, such as being medicated when they're exhibiting expected trauma reactions and not mental illness. While the PREA standards allow survivors to request help getting adequate medical and or mental health care, the standards don't speak to the nature and type of mental health to be provided to survivors, other than the timeline of services and access following a sexual abuse incident while incarcerated. But let me be clear, the standards do provide protection for people with mental illness, and it should be taken into account along with any other vulnerabilities that the person may have. So for example, are they elderly, gender non-conforming, or perhaps slight in build? I want to take a closer look now at some of the PREA protections. So when advocating for an incarcerated survivor with mental illness, as an advocate, one can ensure that a survivor is receiving the necessary services to provide for their safety and dignity. Again, protections are afforded an incarcerated survivor under the PREA Elimination Act or PREA standards, regardless of whether they have a mental illness. That said, the standards require facilities to screen for certain risks upon entry to that facility that identify that identify people as being more vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual harassment. I'm going to throw out some standard numbers if you want to jot them down now. Standards 115.41, those are for the prison and jail standards, and 115.241 for community confinement standards. They say that people with mental illness are not specifically identified, those are the risk assessment standards. People with mental illness are not specifically identified in those sets of standards, 115.41 for prison and jails and 115.241 for community confinement. They do assess for persons with mental disabilities as being listed for as vulnerable, but persons with mental disabilities are not the same as someone with mental illness. So this limits the PREA protection to individuals with sensory disabilities, but does not include protections for individuals with psychiatric or intellectual disabilities. But that said, I want to point out that the standard also says risk categories listed are provided, quote, at a minimum. So mental illness certainly can and should be added by prisons, jails, and community confinement facilities to their assessment processing. If you happen to be participating in our webinar today and you're with a prison, a jail, a community confinement facility, please note that those should be included. Please be assessing for mental illness in that risk assessment at intake. It's also part of the assessment process specifically stated for juvenile facility standards under standard 115.341, 115.341 for juvenile facility standards in PREA. It does specifically assess for mental illness. The bottom line is that standards require vulnerability to be taken into consideration when we make classification decisions, decisions regarding housing, programming, treatment. So I see that as a strong protection for persons with mental illness living on the inside. Also, protections are afforded in all sets of the PREA standards to people with mental illness in the standard on inmates with disabilities and inmates who are limited English proficient. That standard is 115.16. That's the basic standard for prisons and jails, 115.16. Community confinement, 0.26. Juvenile, 0.36. If you know your standards numbers, you'll know the sequencing there. So mental illness is included in that section. The U.S. Department of Justice commented and said, and I'm quoting, "The final standard clarifies that agencies must take appropriate steps to ensure equal opportunity to participate in and benefit from all aspects of efforts to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and sexual harassment for inmates with disabilities, including those with intellectual or psychiatric disabilities." Finally, protections are also specified in all sets of the standards under disciplinary sanctions, interventions, and prosecutorial referrals for inmates. That's a tough word to get out of my mouth. Prosecutorial referrals for inmates. This is standard 115.78 letter C, like in Charlie, 115.78C, under disciplinary sanctions, interventions, and prosecutorial referrals. The disciplinary process says that it shall consider when an inmate's mental disabilities or mental illness contributed to his or her behavior when determining what type of sanction, if any, should be imposed. So let's talk about that. Incarcerated survivors with mental illness are likely to ask for help with navigating or getting a response from a facility pre-grievance or disciplinary process. So you as an advocate, if you're working with an incarcerated survivor with a mental illness, they may have some difficulty with that and come to you for help. They may find themselves in some kind of trouble or facing a disciplinary sanction and say, hey, here's my situation. So being aware of this standard, 115.78 letter C, is important because in terms of the advocacy, it may include helping the survivor if they're disciplined and the disciplinary charge arises out of that survivor having been sexually abused as provided for under this standard. Okay, let's take a look now at this slide. So you see the face of the person whose voice you're about to hear. I'm going to introduce you here to our guest practitioner. We're going to, you won't just have to listen to my voice the whole time. I'm going to have the pleasure now of having Dr. Diana Kucera join us. I had the joy of working with Dr. Kucera on PREA training in Texas last fall. She's very spirited and insightful. She's absolutely dedicated to her professional development and a significant portion of her career to PREA. She not only has been a facility PREA coordinator, but she developed this sexually vulnerable and predator screening tool that's being used by the Illinois Department of Corrections. Currently, Dr. Kucera serves as a treatment unit administrator with the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, and she does have prior experience, including working as a mental health unit director within the State Department of Corrections in Illinois at the Stateville facility. She was a staff psychologist for inmates at the Dixon Correctional Facility in their medium security special treatment center and maximum security psychiatric unit and segregation unit. There's a lot more I could share about her, but if I did that, we would run out of time, and we don't want to do that. So Dr. Kucera, thank you so much for joining us today. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Gwen. I'm so excited to be joining my friends at JDI today for this webinar on a topic that is very close to my heart.
I know it is. I can tell everyone here from knowing you personally, you are absolutely passionate about this. I'm going to kind of run through a few key points here that I know that you can really help our our listeners and those who've joined us today out west. So I want to first kind of dig out of you a little bit here, a little bit more about your prior experience as it relates to working in the community and now with those in detention who have mental illness. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Absolutely, Gwen. So a large portion of my service experience in the community was in a program that provided both group and individual treatment in a milieu setting. The population that I served were adults with developmental disability and severe mental illness. All these individuals resided in group homes, and they were bused each day to our treatment center. I treated individuals with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and various psychotic and thought disorders, as well as personality disorders. Some individuals also suffered from significant cognitive delays and developmental disorders. When I began working in the Illinois Department of Corrections, it was with adult male inmates with similar diagnoses to those that I treated within the community setting. The difference was in a correctionals population, there exists a saturation of various personality disorders, specifically antisocial, narcissistic, and borderline personality disorders. In addition, the presentation of mental health symptoms were often complicated by substance abuse, untreated medical problems, environmental stresses, and just overall poor self-care. As Gwen said, I currently work with a juvenile male population in the Department of Juvenile Justice. This is a particularly challenging population to treat. Juvenile offenders present with a high incidence of PTSD stemming from physical and sexual abuse, neglect, growing up in a low socioeconomic status neighborhoods which have high crime rates and gang violence. In addition to that trauma, these youthful offenders are often diagnosed with ADHD, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is very similar to bipolar disorder in the adult population, conduct disorder, and substance abuse. Their diagnostic presentations are complicated by where they are developmentally. The population that we serve are ages 13 to 20. And science has now proven that full brain development does not occur until approximately age 25.
I think that is really a fascinating statistic that you just mentioned about the brain development, especially in light of the statistic that I mentioned earlier with regard to juveniles and the development of the mental illnesses in between age 14 and then 75% of them the established mental illnesses by age 24. It just seems that those mental illnesses, if they're going to set in, seem to be happening at those younger ages before the brain is fully developed. Diana, I'm going to just ask you another question here, kind of moving a little bit into your perspective on working with the youth. So tell us a little bit more then about what it's like from really a clinical perspective as a clinical psychologist in the State Department of Corrections. You've spent a good deal of time now working with them, so kind of share what that's like for us, please.
Oh, absolutely, Gwen. So within the mental health department, so the culture in corrections, although it's changing in a very positive direction, it is still vastly different from mental health treatment within the community setting. The mental health department in corrections also works, as you've talked about earlier in this presentation, as the ambulance. We put Band-Aids on problems rather than fully healing the wounds. A huge part of our responsibility is indeed crisis management. We are often called to see offenders when they are intensely emotionally dysregulated or actively psychotic, which is often accompanied by self-harm, suicidal ideation, or actual suicide attempts. It is then our job to place the offenders on suicide watch and ensure that both medical personnel and psychiatry also assess them. Offenders remain on suicide watch until we are assured that they are stable and will not commit further harm to themselves and are no longer at risk for suicide. As I have previously mentioned, there is a movement in corrections to provide mental health services as the community standard. We are now meeting with inmates to conduct intake assessments and psychological evaluations that then lend themselves to diagnoses and treatment planning. Psychologists and other mental health professionals provide individual therapy sessions as well as a variety of group treatment. Psychiatrists are on site or available via telehealth to provide psychopharmacological treatments as well. In the juvenile division, there is more emphasis on mental health treatment versus the adult division currently. We have treatment modality that specifically focuses on trauma, which stems from a CBT-DBT model, which means that we focus very much on emotions and behaviors. We run groups as well as individual therapy. Many of our youth have children of their own, so we also offer parenting classes as well. The Department of Juvenile Justice is innovative in that we really do recognize the need for family involvement. Hence, we offer phone, telehealth, and in-person family therapy, as well as other family engagement services. If an offender has been sexually assaulted in the community or while in detention, the experience of being incarcerated re-traumatizes survivors of sexual abuse on multiple levels. Detention, by its sheer nature, removes control from those living within the walls. The lack of control is often a trauma trigger for survivors. Also, cell blocks are often noisy and cells are often shared with a stranger. Survivors must share a small space with a stranger in which you have to use the bathroom in front of and sleep near another offender. Offenders need to be pat searched and sometimes strip searched by security staff, which can be triggering. There's often just overall very limited privacy in this environment. There are also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's good. You're good. I'm just changing. I'm
Okay,
just providing a new picture for them.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so there are many challenges to providing mental health services in corrections. It is often difficult to find space to see offenders. And it is even more challenging is getting security staff to escort the offender to the office or healthcare space to be seen. In addition, there is this consistent balancing act between confidentiality and security. So as a psychologist, I always want to be extremely mindful of speaking with an offender where there is privacy and confidentiality and this is being honored. But due to just safety and security measures that need to be in place, this is often very difficult. Due to the shortage of security staff, just as well as overall limited space, it is often necessary to see offenders for sessions or crisis interventions at the cell front. You know, I just often have to balance my own professional integrity by asking what is more harmful to my client, not having appropriate privacy or just not providing those services at all.
Yeah, I can understand. I can see why that would just be you know, something you really weigh, and I can tell that you weigh it very thoughtfully. You spoke about some of the challenges that you encounter, and I see that these being such key issues that an advocate might encounter something very similar in providing in-person services at a facility as well. So what would you recommend to the advocates who are listening today about working within these constraints or similar constraints?
You know, I think that the main point here is for our advocates to realize that patience will be very important. Security escorts and confidential space for meeting with clients will happen with your understanding and cooperation.
Okay, I'm going to just pull up a new slide here, Diana, but I would like you to continue and talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and how you work through those.
Absolutely. So as mental health professionals, We often have very large and overwhelming caseloads, as Gwen spoke about, earlier in this presentation. It is difficult to hire mental health staff in corrections, and there is also a very high burnout rate. So on average, mental health professionals burn out after 2 years and must leave corrections. At one point in my career, I honestly had a caseload of about 160 inmates. I think that trauma-informed care is becoming absolutely more prevalent in corrections, but from a mental health standpoint, the best practices for trauma treatment are more advanced, and not many clinicians have that background. It's very specialized. I would love to afford a greater level of confidentiality to our inmates as well, but we have limitations by law working in this profession. Although I have not had personal experience with treating clients in the community who have been survivors of sexual abuse, I've worked with clients in detention. I'm aware of the resources available to survivors in the community versus detention, so I can absolutely speak to that. Clients living in the community have easier access to mental health professionals and rape crisis advocates. The important part of this is not only ease of access, but confidentiality. So in detention, it is difficult to keep things private as much as we absolutely try. Some things are on a need-to-know basis, and staff outside of medical and mental health often need some level of information in order to house an offender appropriately, get them to an outside hospital if needed, and also to contact an outside advocate. If a sexual assault occurs in detention, it needs to be reported to wardens and administration, and often needs to be reported up the chain of command within the department. If advocates need to be called, they will need to have gate passes, so information will need to be passed on to front gate staff. Essentially, maintaining confidentiality is much more difficult in detention. So our relationship with our custody counterparts has not always been healthy. We have had to work on the differences in our cultures within the corrections environment. As you can see from this slide, we come at our jobs from very different perspectives, and it creates some distrust and stereotypes that we have to work through to be effective as a team. This climate will likely affect the way that advocates are treated by custody staff as well. It's not uncommon for advocates to be treated similarly or worse than the in-house mental health staff.
Okay, well, I almost called you by your first name, Dr. Crucera. I'm sorry. It's because I know you so well. I think that this is why it's really helpful to have your insight. What do you recommend then, given what you've just said about that climate, to advocates to help them have a more positive relationship and experience with custody staff?
I would just really recommend to be respectful, verbally conveying to them that you understand safety and security, and that you understand that that comes first. Remember that you are a guest in their house, so be gracious and thank them for their services, showing, that you really recognize that their jobs are difficult and stressful. I mean, this can really go a long way.
So I put up a slide here that I think is a really powerful message regarding stigma and discrimination. You can see that the words mental health have been crossed out. It's not I have mental health problems, it's I have problems with oppression and stigma. What have you seen, Dr. Crucera, with how corrections and detention facilities manage inmates with mental health issues, particularly those with severe and persistent mental illness? And I think that, it kind of ties into what we're talking about here with how stigma and discrimination carries over from what a person with mental illness has lived with in the community and follows them into a detention setting.
So historically, due to staff not having experience, education, or training on how to recognize and deal with mental illness, many offenders with mental illness would end up in solitary confinement, which ended up just exacerbating these symptoms. Staff did not understand that negative behavior was stemming from mental illness, including active psychosis and delusions. This is being looked at and remedied throughout the nation. There is a breakdown of the availability of state psychiatric hospitals and community treatment. It is now very known that many individuals with mental health problems end up in prison just due to the lack of community-based treatment. So I would say that over the last decade, corrections has made strides in recognizing the need for mental health professionals, including psychiatrists within the facilities. It is no longer regular practice to house offenders with mental illness in segregation, especially those with severe chronic mental illness. Treatment is indeed moving toward more community-based standards. There are now special treatment units. They're becoming very prevalent within corrections. These units are run more like milieu settings with both individual and group therapy actually held on the unit. Often mental health staff will have their offices on the unit to be readily available. There's also a push to hire activity specialists and behavioral technicians on the units, as well as specially trained officers that provide more therapeutic interventions, rather than the traditional disciplinary approaches. So although I don't think it is best to house a survivor with mental illness in segregation, even at their own request, I would, really work to assist the offender with finding other housing they would feel safer in, possibly a unit that has single celling options or a unit that just houses more vulnerable inmates. But sometimes due to the lack of options in a facility, segregation might be an only option. I think the challenge is when delusions come into play. When a person is feeling unsafe and they are delusional about immediate safety, and they truly believe they can only be safe in segregation, then that may be what relaxes them, and in that moment is indeed the best choice for them. One of the most debilitating conditions for a person with mental illness is not the mental health problem, but the stigma and discrimination thrust upon them by society as a whole. They are strapped by oppression and the labels of their mental illness rather than being recognized and appreciated for their strengths as human beings.
Mm-hmm. I think though there is promising news and information that you shared there about some of the advancements and improvements that you shared about some of the new units that are growing around the country, the response to the de facto mental health institutions being inside of correctional facilities. And while dollars are tight, budgets are strapped, it is at least offering some kind of hope to people who live on the inside with mental illness. Let's say I'm an advocate providing services to incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. What would some of the reasons be that I would want to develop a working relationship with someone like you, Dr. Kucera, a mental health provider in the correctional facility where my clients are living?
I think that relationship is so very important. So as the in-house mental health staff, we work very closely with all departments, including security. So we have a more holistic understanding of the offenders we are working with. In addition, we can speak to the mental health issues, we can speak to psychotropic medications, the history of our clients, and just overall behavior while they've been incarcerated. We are a wealth of information that can help you better understand and work with your client. We can also be your point of contact to help you get in touch with your client, meet with your client, and overall assist with navigating the sometimes complex world of corrections. Sharing information back and forth as allowed can also help us better serve our inmates with the additional insight you may be able to provide to us. We can also assist with your ability to gain rapport and trust with your clients. Most often, we have good working relationship with our offenders on our caseloads, regardless of how heavy those caseloads may be.
we're gonna switch a little bit now and look more closely at what advocates can do. Dr. Kucera, I really appreciate your insight. It's been tremendously helpful, and thank you so much. I don't want to let you go just yet, though. We want you to stay with us to provide some more guidance during our question and answer segment shortly. And I want to ask you one last question right now, though. How can our advocates who are listening best support incarcerated survivors with mental illness? Just one closing thought, key thought from you.
Well, Gwen, I'd say the number one issue that mental health staff in corrections probably face is their inclination to treat the mental illness, which means that the survivor rarely, if ever, gets the treatment they need for their trauma. You know, it's a challenge. A person with a mental illness brings a lot into the room. As advocates, you can treat them for what they're coming to you for. That is their trauma as a survivor.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree with you 1,000%. Thank you so much. I think something I want to make into a poster. I think it's very important. You pointed out so many limitations that mental health providers in corrections have in providing services to prisoners with mental illness. And in your role as advocates, we hope that you can fill the gaps in services in meaningful ways. And we've stated the problems. Now let's take a look more specifically at what you can do as advocates through providing those direct services to incarcerated survivors with mental illness. In JDI's decades of experience working with incarcerated survivors, many of whom have a severe mental illness, and through our partnerships with advocates in this journey, we've identified a number of effective approaches for advocates to work with this client base. Similarly to how you'd likely respond to anyone who walks through your door at your rape crisis center or your community-based organization, we'd want you to respond in a way that's genuine and appropriate and empowering to the survivor. And your response is really critical to their healing, as you probably already know, of course. As you also know, it can have that lasting impact on their recovery journey. So for incarcerated survivors, it's extremely important as well. You may be their one and only support because they're often not believed by staff or anyone else that they have the opportunity to talk with. Staff might not have the training skills, as we talked about, to really respond supportively, and certainly not the time. As Dr. Kucera mentioned, the overburdened caseloads, just the overburdened work and responsibilities don't lend themselves, and they may not have the significant training in specifically working with sexual abuse survivors. Key as well is the piece that Dr. Kucera emphasized, that mental health staff in detention facilities are required to report any crimes that occur within the facility. So survivors of sexual abuse can't speak to them about this sexual abuse confidentially unless they're prepared to report. This means that when you're talking with survivors as advocates, a survivor who has a mental illness, they may open up to you and feel more comfortable doing so, exploring whether or not they want to report, and they may choose never to report, as you know. It's really important to respond to those feelings they're having. If the consent of the survivor's speech, if the content of the survivor's speech seems delusional, just continue to respond without validating the delusions. Don't dismiss or minimize their experience. It's not necessary to ask the survivor anything about what they're saying that may seem delusional from our perspective or your perspective, unless you're really trying to get information about what you think might actually have happened. But then just be also really mindful and very careful. Sometimes people with mental illness may tell their stories in ways that seem confusing, or they may even include content that doesn't seem reality-based. This may be because of the trauma as well as the mental illness, and it doesn't mean that their story isn't untrue. It's most important to respond to the feelings the survivor is expressing and to support them through those feelings, as you would for any survivor. They are very real feelings, and they might be particularly pronounced after a recent sexual assault. So please be an active listener and take all those concerns seriously, but focus on the feelings, not the beliefs or thoughts that they may be expressing that may not sound like they're based in reality. For example, we can say, "That does sound scary," or "That seems to make you sad." Let me emphasize again the fact that some thoughts or experiences may not seem to be based in reality, but it doesn't mean a sexual assault did not occur. As I talked to you earlier about Kelly, who was diagnosed recently by the facility psychiatric team as having a diagnosed mental illness, in Kelly's situation, the PREA reports have been unsubstantiated. That does not mean unfounded. All survivors have complex experiences. They may have been traumatized many times previously in their life, and that trauma can influence the way they communicate their experiences. It's also important for you to remember to plan disruptions in individual sessions or even in longer-term plans to work with a survivor. Emergencies in the facility, for example, can cut a session short. Or if you're working with a survivor with mental illness, you may find that they may have a difficult time working with you in a session for as long of a period of time, depending upon the conditions of their mental illness. The detention environments can be unpredictable. Something might trigger your client, and they may have to be given the opportunity to take a break. Prisoners also get transferred to other facilities, and you may have no advanced warning. You may have an appointment, show up at the facility, and find out that the prisoner or the survivor is no longer at that facility. Always a good idea to call ahead of time if you're doing in-person counseling services, just to make sure that your session is still on and that your client is actually still available to you that day. Another thing to do is to be sure to leave time to wrap up a session. You want to be working with a client on developing a coping and safety plan well in advance of the end of your session with them. This applies to calls on hotline as well, especially if you're working with a client with a mental illness, so that you don't find that you're cut short at the end of your time with them and leaving them hanging on how to be able to work through their time alone before they have the next opportunity to check in with an advocate. Help the survivors really identify and build those coping skills, something that's realistic to what their needs might be, and specifically within the environment that they're living in. That applies to developing a realistic safety plan for survivors. They're going to have those fears. The experience that you might have working with domestic violence survivors, safety planning is much the same, but remember that the environment they're living in is different in the correctional facility. Let's take a look and talk for a minute now about you as advocates. You're already trained and you're working with clients in the community to maintain healthy boundaries. But how about maintaining healthy boundaries between your professional and personal life? Do you work on building resilience to hold the emotional impact of the survivor's trauma? Their trauma splashes over onto you. Do you remember to take the advice and use the grounding techniques that you are suggesting for your clients? Are you being the best you that you can be and taking care of yourself? Be clear with your clients about your limits and what you can and cannot do for them. If we don't overpromise, we won't let them down and we won't let ourselves down. And it helps us with maintaining that resilience. And finally, prepare yourself for the unexpected, because it's likely to occur whenever you're working with incarcerated survivors, as I said. You might wonder whether you're qualified to treat a survivor with a mental illness and complex trauma who lives in an incarcerated environment. As JDI's Director of Mental Health, Vanessa Sapien, who we see here on the slide, she's the woman on the right, told me, quote, "At the end of the day, you don't have to be trained to treat a client with dissociative identity disorder who has multiple personalities. Your role is still to meet them wherever they are that day and support them as a survivor. Don't refer them out to mental health. They've likely been passed over and bounced around without support for a long time. Be present, be an advocate."
Thank you so much, Gwen. You've provided a lot of information, a lot of useful information. Now we're ready to take some questions. Remember, you can enter them in the chat box in the right-hand side. While you do that, I want to mention a few resources available on the JDI website. First is Hope Behind Bars. This is a guide for advocates in working with incarcerated survivors. The link to this resource is available in the discussion guide that accompanies this webinar, and you'll get that afterwards. There is also a host of resources available to you on JDI's website. This slide shows the link, which is also included in the resource guide. And that link is, or the website is www.justdetention.org/advocate-resources. You want to put that up, Gwen?
Yeah, I think there it is. I'm sorry, they're flipped around, but there it is.
Okay. Finally, one of the key features of the JDI Resource Guide for survivors of sexual abuse behind bars is that your agency can add its own name and information to the document. This will ensure that your organization is included as a resource for survivors seeking support in your state. And we send these out to every survivor that writes to us. So it would be, if you're not included, it would be helpful if you did send us your information so we could add you. So do we have any questions? Gwen, do you have any on your end?
I'm not seeing anything in here. Let me look over here on the screen. Okay, let's see. I was on a hotline call with my client, who is a trans woman with mental illness. I could hear slurs and mocking of her in the background. I could also hear a correctional officer talking to her to get off the phone. She was very upset by the sexual harassment. Should I tell anyone at the facility about this? And do I need my client's permission to do so? Well, I'll answer that one. Yes, you need your client's permission to do so. Confidentiality, as an advocate, you should know the laws regarding confidentiality in your state, and you should also know the policy that you have within your own agency regarding confidentiality and how you would handle a situation like that. You definitely would want the client's permission and make them aware that you can hear what's happening to them in the background, and being, in terms of compassionate and supportive, respond to how the caller is feeling. It says here the caller was very upset by the sexual harassment. If your organization is able to offer advocacy, talk to the client about the possibilities or options of what you might be able to offer. You're not going to tell anyone at the facility unless you already know that you have a policy or some type of advocacy options available to the caller. So talk that through and see if the client feels comfortable with that. Be sure you explore with the client what the potential outcomes might be. If you do follow up with the facility, that you want to be sure that the client understands that following up with the facility is essentially reporting sexual harassment, and that would trigger a PREA investigation and what that means. So just be very, very careful, deliberate, and thorough in how you would handle that with the client. I've got some other ones, Edward. Have you seen any come through there? I'm going to read this one. I'm an advocate. Okay. I'm an advocate. A survivor has told me that he has mental illness and he's not being allowed to shower and isn't getting as much rec time as he needs. Why would this be, and is there anything I can do to advocate for him? Diana, what are your thoughts on that? The survivor is telling the advocate they're not being allowed to shower or getting as much rec time as needed. Why might this be, and is there anything that an advocate can do for this survivor?
Yes, absolutely. I would recommend, I think this would be a great time to use your relationship with the in-house mental health staff. This is actually a pretty common complaint or concern with offenders that I've worked with, especially those with mental illness. I mean, it can be twofold. It can be that there are times when offenders aren't allowed to shower. And this could be because there's a lockdown or other security measures. Part of this could be part of the mental illness that they have been taking showers, but they don't recall taking showers and stuff like that. But, you know, I would really recommend to get a hold of the in-house mental health staff to discuss the situation, what is going on, express your concerns. This is something we can easily bring to administration, to custody staff. You know, if indeed I need to make sure that the offender is getting showers, is getting additional recreation time. This is something, especially now that the culture is changing and mental health staff has a lot more communication with administration, that if we need more rec time for an offender that's having distress or experiencing mental health issues, that's certainly something that we can advocate for on our end.
Great, I think it's really helpful.
Okay, I have another question, Gwen.
Mm-hmm.
If a survivor writes a letter to your agency reaching out for assistance, how are you able to respond without there being a P2 signed? P2? Sorry, I'm not familiar with that. But with this being a requirement, how can you either write back or phone the survivor? This is something we are currently facing.
Okay, yeah, and I see that kind of as a follow-up to my response to the other question. This is Just Detention International operates a hotline. We have a contract with the Office for Victims of Crime. We have funding to provide what we call an inside line, and right now we have a memorandum of agreement with Michigan Department of Corrections, and we provide the crisis emotional support hotline for incarcerated survivors in any Michigan prison facility. And one of the ways that we do this is we do take verbal authorization over the hotline. So if a survivor calls us and they have a situation, we talk it through with them similarly to how I answered the other question, and they give us verbal permission. We make note of that in our files, and we go ahead based on verbal permission. We also will mail out to them a written authorization, a written consent form and typed consent form, and then they can sign it and send it in to us. So we have the ability, we do that for survivors who write letters to the agency, but we handle it that way in terms of the phone line so that we don't have to wait for the mail process. You know, sometimes the crisis situation is a much more emergent situation. We don't have the time to wait for the mail process to go back and forth from Just Detention International through the DOC mail processing system, received to the inmate, and then back out again to handle a situation.
Okay, can I ask another one?
Oh, sure, please.
It says, what is your recommended procedure for serving a client who was previously incarcerated but is now residing in a domestic violence shelter?
So I'm processing that in my head. So it sounds like we're talking about here, we had someone who was previously incarcerated, they've been released, they're now living in a domestic violence shelter, and we're talking about procedure for providing victim services, ongoing support services for that client. And interestingly enough, I have another question here that's how can I support continuity of care for my client who has a mental illness and is about to be released? I don't want her to fall through the cracks and not receive the mental health support that she'll need in the community. I kind of see those two questions related. Diana, because you work in the system, what do you see as the way to make sure that there is that continuity of care? And then I'll do a little follow-up specific to the question that Edward posed if I need to supplement your response.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So with continuity of care, I find this to still be a very challenging aspect of my job. I know from my end that sometimes it is simpler if the offender is going out on parole, because then that can be simple recommendations with parole to find services out in the community, and then being able to link up with that community support to provide, after I have a release of information signed, to provide that information to the community support. It's much more difficult, at least from my experience, when an offender is being released and it's just a pure discharge and they're not linking up with any parole services. Often offenders they may not necessarily know where they're going to be living or going, and it's very difficult to get them to follow up with mental health services. Something we do is try to make phone calls on behalf of the offenders to find some services within the area that we know they are going to be living in, and get them an appointment ahead of time, and encourage them, give them the name of their contact at that community service agency, give them, information about when their appointment is, and discuss that before they're released, in order for them to follow up within the community. But this is still very challenging, and I find that we are still falling short being able to provide continuity of care in the community. I don't know what your experience has been, Gwen, or what advice you can provide from your perspective.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing in women's prison in Wyoming is they are working, meaning the advocates in the community through the Rape Crisis Support, the Victim Services organization. The community is working directly with through the PREA compliance manager at the facility with the reentry unit in the women's facility, and helping with that reentry readiness for women who were within 3 to 6 months of release from the facility, to make sure that they are connecting them with all of the services. And such a high percentage of them, statistics that we know are 91% of women who are living on the inside have some type of sexual violence history. And so they're very much in need of trauma support services and recovery from that sexual violence past, and getting them connected and ready for transition, already connected with the community-based sexual assault organization, is so important. They most likely have never had any kind of support for that trauma and been working on healing. This is a perfect opportunity to be able to work with them while they're on the inside and get them ready and transitioning into the community. So if they do end up residing, heavens forbid, but if they do end up residing in a domestic violence shelter when they come out, serving a client who's previously been incarcerated, they will have some of that complex trauma and some of the aspects of having been an incarcerated individual to have to deal with, and some of that stigma follows them for the rest of their life, particularly if they have a felony record, because of so many laws that deny them access to housing, to jobs, to so many things that complicate their lives on the outside. But just being able to recognize again that meet them where they're at in their life, work with them as that human being, that survivor in need of your services, recognizing that they're released. They are no longer, an incarcerated individual, and in your eyes, they are a survivor who needs your support, just as you would provide anyone else support in that domestic violence shelter. If they are on parole, it's not your job to connect with their parole agent. It's your job to support them in what their needs are. Communicate with them and make sure that you are helping them stay mindful of their responsibility of meeting their parole appointments, because they do have responsibility to meet up with their parole agent regularly. And you don't want them to get parole violations and end up back on the inside simply because they violate rather than reoffending.
I have one more question, Gwen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what is your suggestion on how to go about not validating a situation that sounds like mental illness when that's what they are looking for? For instance, if they ask, "I hear them in the lights talking about me. You believe me, right?" how would you suggest somebody respond?
Okay. Okay. I hear them in. So this is the survivor
Right.
saying, "I hear them in the light." Okay.
Correct.
Got you. Believe me, right? I believe that you are hearing them in the lights. Yes, I believe that that's what you are hearing. You can believe them that this is their experience. I believe that this is your experience. It's not because they are having that experience. That is very much their experience. We can believe their perception of this situation. We don't have to believe that it's the reality of what has actually happened.
And I
I hope that makes sense to the person. Yeah, go ahead, please, Diana.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and kind of what you talked about earlier in the presentation, just validating feelings that may go along with that.
Yes,
that does sound very scary. I can see that's upsetting you, validating the feelings
yes.
rather than the experience. You know, that's always, you know, something. And it also helps you gaining rapport with your client as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback on the webinar. We value your feedback and use it to improve future presentations. This link will be emailed to you shortly. Please also forward it to anyone who may have joined you today. And we also encourage you to reach out to JDI if you're looking for a resource or have questions about providing services to incarcerated survivors. As I mentioned before, please visit JDI's website for advocate-specific resources, but also explore our website. There's a wealth of resources and stories and photos available for you there. Please email us at advocate@justdetention.org with any other questions you may have. Stay tuned for additional announcements for other webinars in this series. Please take care, and thank you so much for the work that you do with survivors.
Yes, thank you, everyone.